we've got a panel here for the last hour, and Polly Morgan in the middle is going to be chairing the panel, and she's working predominantly in the law school, and she's the deputy head of the law school, and she's the chief operating officer of the UEA Law Clinic as well. So we're in good hands, I think. I'll pass you over to our chair, Polly.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I hope you have had a really good day today. In this final Q&A session, we're going to be talking about learning spaces, temporal, physical, metaphorical, perhaps. Fabio's looking frightened at that. I'm joined by Neil, who you'll know is our Pro-VC academic, Kay, who is our Associate Dean Learning and Teaching Enhancement, Phil, who is a University Teaching Fellow, and Fabio, who is a National Teaching Fellow. So throughout the day, you've been putting some questions for the panel on post-it notes out in the foyer. So we're going to start with those, but please feel free to chime in. Just stick your hand up. We've got some roving microphones. And with questions and comments and other things that you would like to ask the panel about. Okay? So I'm going to kick off with quite a general question to Neil, which is, in the next 5 years, what do you see as the key features of learning and teaching here at UEA?
How are things going to change?
Yes.
Well, I think if we take this learning spaces idea, then we'll have some new learning spaces in the next 5 years. Can you hear me all right at the back? Yep. So we'll have the new science laboratories, which I think will make quite a big impact. A lot of our science students will be learning in new kinds of spaces. Actually, they will have been doing that for about 4 years in 5 years' time. We'll have a big new building as well with additional teaching space, which will also serve as a new entrance to the university, I think. So there'll be changes to the physical fabric, and we'll be well into refurbishing the Lasdon Wall as well. I think in terms of how we go about learning and teaching, I'm thinking perhaps from a national sort of policy perspective, I think there will be more interest in inclusivity and in understanding differential performance of students and what we do to try and reduce barriers to success for different groups of students. So I think whereas 5 years ago up to now we've perhaps been concerned with how our scores are doing sort of on aggregate as an institution, student satisfaction and good honours and employability and that sort of thing, I think we'll be challenged much more about gaps between different types of students. So I think inclusivity will be a much stronger theme in thinking about our teaching practice and thinking about how our teaching is kind of strategically managed and developed. I think also, and this probably won't be popular, but I think we'll probably be even more metricised than now. I think there'll be more measures and more data. And while some of that will be for things like the Teaching Excellence Framework and sort of grading the university and how it's doing, I think perhaps more valuable and more exciting will be the way that data can be used to understand individual student engagement and performance and needs and support. So I think we'll probably have more developments in terms of informatics around individual students and how they're going about their studies and that can be used to help and support them.
So in terms of an inclusive learning space, is that, to what extent can we measure that successfully, whether our curriculum is inclusive in a sense of accessible to diverse groups of students, Yeah, other than sort of widening participation metrics?
I don't know, because I mean, to date, a lot of stuff on inclusivity has been about just the admissions picture. So it's just been about the demographic complexion of your student body. And over the last couple of years, that's evolved to be more interested in, well, first of all, the complexion of the intake, but then continuation, and how does continuation vary amongst different groups, and then good honours, and then employability. So the sort of main ways in which we measure aspects of educational outcomes, I guess. When it comes to spaces and how we would know what success looks like, I mean, all of our new spaces are designed with maximum sort of accessibility. I think there's still work to be done in terms of thinking about how different kinds of students might be responding, to different learning environments and different kinds of spaces. And I haven't really thought about what success would look like there. That's something for me to take away and think about, I think.
Does anyone have any views on what inclusive spaces might look like? Well, oh, Vic, go ahead, sorry.
It's not so much space, but it's something else that you raised, and it's the notion of the different backgrounds that students come from. And it seems to me that entirely rightly, I should say, obviously I would say that as I work occasionally for CSED nowadays, but the universities put an enormous amount of resource into training staff and making them pedagogically equipped and conscious. It seems to me that what we haven't spent enough time doing, partly because it's been left to the devices of individual schools, some of which are good and some of which are bloody awful, quite frankly, that we need to, if we're going to even the ground for all students, is we need to train them to study. And we're not spending enough time and trouble at the beginning of students' careers, it seems to me, to ensure that from wherever they come from, they're all at the same starting point in terms of their ability to study at university level. So I think that, in terms of what I would like to see going on, is that as a thought informing what's being done.
Thank you. Oh yes, somebody behind.
Thank you. I just wanted to feed back on the point that was just raised, really. I head up the Learning Enhancement Team in the Student Support Service, and our remit is to do precisely the sort of work that you're talking about, and we work pretty comprehensively across the university with schools. And I think what you're talking about it looks different in different places, and obviously there's an element in which it needs to be tailored for individuals, but it also needs to be tailored for different kinds of disciplines as well. And so the best work that we do is when we work closely and form partnerships with staff and with students across the university in those schools to understand the particular context in which they're working. And as I say, I think we're a service that the university is invested in, and that we've grown over a period of time and been able to increase the capacity with which we can do that work. There's more to be done, but I think there is a lot of good work that happens already, and I think perhaps part of what we need to do is to help raise awareness about that service amongst students and staff.
And we'll just pick up, there's a couple of ladies at the back there.
Thanks. I think Neil talking about metrics and then us moving on to inclusivity and illustrates to a certain extent how metrics have skewed things, because we have aimed to fulfill our metric of widening our diversity of our students, but we haven't actually thought about making the space appropriate for them. And as you said, most of us won't be very happy with the more metrics, and I think actually the qualitative nature of a university is getting lost in metricization.
Okay, ladies first, and I will. I just wanted to go back to kind of the question, kind of how can we rethink about the spaces that that we have to. Oh, can you remind me of the question a little bit?
We were looking.
Put myself back there. Sorry.
That's all right. Well, we were looking at why spaces matter. Jeremy raised the point of different spaces for different disciplines. But the first question I gave to Neil was, how will learning and teaching change in the next 5 years?
So when you asked for suggestions around how those spaces could be thought about differently, the suggestions that have come from the audience have been thinking about kind of university being the space and how do we kind of change that. I guess I'm thinking about kind of how we invite people from outside of university and outside of academia into those spaces so that the learning, to enrich everybody's learning in terms of kind of having those shared conversations where learning happens. And following on from what that lady was saying, that might be hard to measure in terms of kind of qualitative data. But you know, I'm thinking of an example I saw where young people were taught, students were taught about human rights and the rights of children, and so looking at kind of some childcare law alongside asylum-seeking children who were taught at the same time about their rights as young people. And it was just a really interesting example of kind of how people were then using that space as a kind of shared learning. But yeah, so I think kind of inviting people in and kind of changing the question about who are we teaching and how does that happen. Thank you.
Hi. Going to the question of inclusive spaces, I think that technology will accelerate the process of considering what a university might be. So thinking that this is the place where the knowledge is conveyed to the students, I think technology will change and is changing dramatically that. So Jeremy was mentioning that here the partnership with the students, and then the lady just spoke about external speakers coming in. I believe that that trend will probably go on disappearing, because probably with technology the expert can be in his or her office and then students kind of attending the transmission of knowledge. In my view, I think that university still in the beginning of the 21st century is seen as a conveyor of knowledge instead of a partnership between conveying knowledge and conveying or the nurturing, development and increasing of soft skills, something that we don't see much. As a way that is integrated into the curriculum. But I think that we need to make more obvious that the acquisition of soft skills is the most difficult bit, because knowledge can be with technology acquired in a beach in Singapore or in Malaysia or in another part of the world. But it's the skills that are soft skills that we need to focus on in order to tied it with knowledge and then therefore give expectations to the students that they can have a better future. We'll call it a better job or better standard of living or well-being.
Well, let me put that to Phil, because you're nodding here. Maybe you wish you hadn't been nodding here.
No, I was thinking it is a very interesting question. What will the shape of learning look like in 5 years' time? And I was thinking, well, in one sense, it all depends on who our students are, and I think Neil's already alluded to that to some extent. But whatever shape our learning spaces and our approach to learning takes, it needs to be shaped by the need of the student. And if it isn't, if it's shaped by something else, I think that's going to be problematic. If there's a diversion between what we're offering and what we're doing and what the students want and need, that's problematic. I think the other thing I would also like to make a plea for, because I can't tell the future, but I can understand the past as a historian, I would really welcome a move back towards one of the founding principles of UEA. It was one of the things that attracted me as an undergraduate, which is that the notion of interdisciplinarity, the breaking down of the silos, the sharing of good practice across and between. And that might mean revisiting some of the physical space, but it also requires a philosophical and intellectual shift. And that is the kind of learning space I think I would be really interested in.
So, one part of what you said was the idea that universities place full knowledge, but the knowledge is not just the transmission of knowledge, it's from the direction of the student, what they get out of it. And the spaces help determine what they get out of it. But also, of course, their learning is not limited to what happens in the lecture theatre. And so when we talk about learning spaces, we need to talk about the private study and things that Vic was talking about, how we orient them within that space. Do you have anything to...
I believe that the important dimension that we have to think in terms of inclusivity as well is the element of socialization. And you know, we talk about issues related with mental health, related to loneliness, issues related with different groups of students who feel they don't belong or cannot connect with each other, is due to divisions that we can facilitate by having spaces where people can actually interact with each other. And even in my little, I can bring a little example from the School of Economics. When we moved in registry, we had the opportunity to negotiate with the university of opening up some of this space and having a student space where students actually come. And it's been the best thing we ever done. And we were grateful that we were allowed to do that, because then the students are starting to populate our space. So it's not a space just for academics. The students are coming then, and a lot of very important conversations are taking place. Conversations related to learning, even though they are not, you know, in a learning space as we tend to define. So having students talking to each other is one of the most important things.
And I recognise that because, of course, the law school's in Earnham Hall, and our students are dotted around everywhere, and we have a ghost, if you believe in that kind of thing. And actually, so these kind of conversations happen quite spontaneously as staff and students are passing through and working in different areas. Okay, sorry, it's the hot seat now. On the issue of technology and learning spaces, it seems to me there's a potential for the space to be, for learning to be enhanced by technology for different groups, but also a risk perhaps of isolation if, for example, we move more towards digital and online learning and individualisation. What do you think?
I think that digital capacity or enhancement through having digital capability is part of what it means to be a student in 21st century higher education. I think that students are expecting a certain level of digital resources and a blended learning experience. And the student union talk I went to just prior to this, both Jenna and Georgina were very eloquent in reminding us that the students coming to us now are very different students to the students that we were when we entered into higher education. The landscape has changed considerably. The way that they are taught in schools has changed considerably. And universities don't always catch up with that level of change. Perhaps they are not as reactive. Perhaps they are a lot more siloed. Perhaps we are very much wedded to what we used to do 20 years ago, and we're not that comfortable in changing practice. The question that was on the board, which I quite liked, was, do learning spaces need tech? Actually, no, I don't think they do always need tech, because it really depends on what you want to teach in that space. I think that, you know, if you want to give a lecture presentation on, for example, DNA replication, and that has to be taught as it is, you can do that in a didactic way, and that can be captured, and then you can have discussion about it. Or you can take that didactic approach and you can use a flipped learning, so students would watch that content ahead of time, and then they would come to sessions with a far more discursive approach. So I think we need to think about what we want to use these spaces for, and if you want to use digital capability, then they should be enabled for digital capability. But if you don't, and if you want to use round table discussions, if you want to have group work, then you need a space which is going to enable that, and you don't necessarily need technology to do that. Victor's really interesting talk, which I went to on historians in space, was talking about field walking, taking students into the city, pointing things out. You need knowledge, and you need somebody who's going to show students how to observe. That doesn't need technology. That needs understanding and sympathetic ways to impart knowledge to students. So technology is not a be-all and end-all. It's a tool to gain learning in one way. but I think there are just as valuable other ways of learning aside from technology.
How do we design learning spaces that can do all of these things?
By having perhaps a bit more flexibility in chairs and tables, that you are enabled with your cabling and your digital capability. And Matt North, he spoke about how these spaces are being refreshed across the university, and he and I work quite closely together in future projects. But it's about being able to do spaces. It's about thinking, you know, if you're going to do something which is discursive in a lecture theatre, you can do that, but you need to think about how that's designed. Can the raking seating be turned around so that students can work in groups? Can students use walls to work on? So digital sticky whiteboards, which I use quite a lot if I'm in a teaching space. I think that I would like to see more sensitivity in the timetabling, and we're thinking and trying to work on this and how more appropriate teaching can take place in more appropriate spaces. I think it's about being matching those needs together, so that if you are doing something which is very discursive, then you are given a room that really enables that to happen. And I think that that's one of the things that I see that the university being able to provide in the future is a much better marry between space and the actual event which is occurring within that space.
Do you think we're moving away from a sort of audience-facing lecture format?
Not necessarily, because I think that I think a didactic lecture can offer a lot. I think it's about a mix. It's about being able to have a whole range of different teaching and learning experiences, well, learning experiences really, and how we choose to deliver that can be many and varied. So I don't think we should think that the didactic lecture is gone because delivered well. It can be a really exciting and inspirational experience. So I wouldn't want to see it go, but I think we want to have variety. And I think that comes with kind of becoming less siloed, to actually look at what good practice looks like in other disciplines and how those techniques can cross over into other areas.
So, yes.
One of the things I noticed during that conversation there was that there was talk about technology, but talking of technology always slipped back into technology in the classroom.
Yes.
Now, I can understand that because I teach a technology-heavy course. I teach computer science where people tend to be pretty much bolted to the floor in terms of the technology they've got to use. You can't rearrange the rooms. But that's a side issue, because I think for me, the key thing is, fine, we need to involve more technology in our teaching, for all the reasons that people have said, but what doesn't seem to be keeping up with it is the technology for interaction. So we have blended learning, or more strictly blended teaching, but we don't have equivalently blended social interaction. Now, I know this because I wear two hats. I'm a lecturer, but I'm also a PhD student, but I work and live remotely. And it's extremely difficult to interact with this university remotely, because everything assumes you're on campus. So people will say, just pop by my office. No, I'm 50 miles away. And the university needs to come into the 21st century regards that, because if you're going to position all this stuff as technology-led blended learning, then you need to be able to support people who are not physically here.
Yeah, I think that's right, and you raise a very interesting point. Actually, Charlie, I'm going to kind of Charlie's from CETAL, you might know, but I and Helen, we set up a Blackboard Collaborate where we streamed a live session from a room in music, I think it was, wasn't it? Out to Charlie in CETAL to see whether Blackboard Collaborate could be used for a kind of like a live streaming. And it was interesting, it worked. Charlie was able to raise her hand and ask questions and take part in discussions. So there is that capability. It was a little clunky. I think there are probably ways that could be done better, but I think the potential is there for it, and the potential is there for it now. It's not something which is in 5 years' time. We can do this now, but we need to have some confidence to try it, and just to sort of say, we're going to try it, we're going to give it a go, and I think that sometimes that can be a little bit missing.
I can see that, and I can see that there are some interesting experiments going on, but I think it's more fundamental than that. I think it's that the university as a whole needs to move itself to supporting distance better. For example, I get weekly emails saying, please check your pigeonhole. Yeah? What is going into a pigeonhole, and if so, why? What's the point of that? Why aren't we fully electronic? If we're going to have distant students, and I know we're in a minority, and I know there's an issue with the student unions supporting distant students because they don't realise we exist either. I think this is the way the university is going to go. People are going to be interacting with technology more rather than physically being present, because that's just the way life is. And I would really like to see the university kind of catch that wave.
So the question is, how can we make those students feel just as included? Yes, and obviously we've all got on our mind student well-being and wanting to give our students the best possible experience, but also to know when a student is not having a good time. Is there any way that we can use technology or turn to digital, enhance our digital practices and not lose sight of that? Could you just solve this in 30 seconds, Phil?
How do you make the distant inclusive and not isolating? I think it comes back to the notion of being part of a community, as a community of practice. And that can be a physical community of practice, but it can also be a virtual community of practice. I think it depends entirely on how the course is conceived and set up. If it was conceived for delivery in a face-to-face mode, but is delivered online, that's a problem. If you're going to do anything online that has meaning and incorporates the whole idea of a community of practice and the externality of that, it has to be designed with that principle in mind. It has to be designed from there up. And I think too often, I've seen it and I've tried to do it myself, we've tried to move from one mode of delivery into another without fully understanding the distinction between the two. So yeah, it's about the design and it's about the conception of this as a community of practice. And that might start to speak to some of the issues around isolation. And also, getting technology that works first time, every time would also help.
Yes.
Picking up on some of the things you're talking about, inclusive spaces, and you mentioned about having choice in your teaching decisions. And we're from the library and learning services in Suffolk, and our main teaching room we changed last year into a dynamic teaching space. And what I'm finding in my teaching approaches is that I'm going into whatever I'm teaching thinking first and foremost about my learning outcomes, what I want to achieve, and then how do I use that space to get there. When I have to go over to the main building, I'm in a lecture theatre like this, I'm not doing that because I'm so constrained by the environment that I'm in. And it's made me really aware of how much that environment is forming my pedagogic decisions in how I'm teaching. And the fact that we have one room we're mostly based in has completely changed for me that level of engagement and really made me able to pick a lecture when it was appropriate, pick a discussion when it's appropriate, use technology when it's appropriate, not use technology. And we don't have enough of that dynamic teaching space where the tables move, they're on wheels, it's brilliant.
Yes, the tables and the chairs are on wheels in the Enterprise Centre, and if you sit down, you do, yes, you can shoot across the floor, you have to be a bit careful. Is that the future of learning spaces, flexibility in everywhere?
Yeah, flexibility, accessibility, I think that's as important. Accessibility from the point of view of the facilitator as well as the point of view of the student. I think all of those are all really important issues which we need to be mindful of as we build new spaces and refurbish old spaces.
We've talked a bit about students being digital natives. Do you think, somebody's asked here, is the digital divide getting wider or narrower?
I think it's interesting. So much depends on your perspective. I think that from my own personal perspective, I think my children have got very good at using technology, but I don't necessarily think they understand the programming behind it. They're not computer scientists, but they're avid users. So I think there is a distinction as to what you might mean there in terms of kind of really deeply understanding it or being a surface user, and that's really all you want to be. So I think there, and I think that we have a situation where some people can be quite scared of new technology, and new technology moves on so quickly that you can get used to one way of doing something and then that goes. A good example would be 5 years ago for student discussion, I'd use a discussion tool called Blickbook, which I loved and the students loved. But then it was just bought over, it was removed, and now I have to use something else. So you're always having to keep ahead, and it's actually really easy to slip back very quickly and not be ahead of the new app or the new thing that's coming forward. But you've also got to kind of treat what's coming up with, you know, you've got to think about, well, why am I using it? You know, what is
I went to a talk you gave on Blickbook,
Yeah.
actually, and I was impressed by the level of engagement your students had with that online source, because certainly whenever I've tried to use discussion boards on Blackboard, even anonymously, the students will just email me individually rather than use the discussion board.
Yes.
So what is it that's made that work? Is it about how you've set expectations, or is it the design of the learning space?
I think it was the design of the learning space, but it's not there anymore. So, you know, and I have moved over to using Blackboard's discussion board, but it hasn't been as successful. And it was about the way that particular piece of software was constructed and how they interfaced with it that made it successful. And I haven't seen anything like it in since. So you have to be reactive to change. You can't get too wedded to how you do things, because it does change, and you've got to be really aware of that.
And one of the issues is you come to a day like today and you're filled with great ideas, and then you go back and you think, oh, I've got to do this, and this. So when am I going to get the time, the temporal space to do innovation? But you're very good at this. You've mastered technology to improve feedback and things like that.
Yes, and it was thanks to the first learning and teaching day I attended here at UEA that I saw how to use clickers. But this actually is heading in the direction where I wanted to lead.
Okay.
Which is, so far we've been talking about learning spaces. Of course, this is the topic of our day, and technology. But I will just stand that, to me, the most important thing is pedagogy. I started to use technology, and it was a bit of fun. And then I actually had to stop and say, actually, what am I doing with this? Yeah?
You want to achieve.
Because students are going to have fun the first time, the second time, the third time, and after that, it's just a tool like any other, which is fine, which is absolutely fine. So it's the pedagogical approach. And in my opinion, we need to do more, all of us as a community, in terms of developing our openness to different pedagogical approaches. If there are constraints in terms of the space, you can smooth them thanks to a different pedagogical approach. Thanks to pedagogy and knowledge about good pedagogical approaches, you can inform how our learning space is supposed to be shaped. And in my opinion, that is extremely important. I also want to touch very briefly on, so there was some comment about metrics. And of course, yeah, when we hear about metrics, we get really worried. But once again, you know, in my opinion, it's really dangerous when we talk about metrics driving all this. So metrics driving the pedagogy, metrics driving teaching spaces, metrics driving what we do. But it's also true the reverse, that thanks to proper evaluation, we can actually see what works and what doesn't. So for instance, in active learning has been demonstrated by studies that actually learning really, really works. I was very resistant to that, and I had to be convinced, and I had to try for myself. So that is a very good way to use metrics, when metrics are at the end of the process and not at the beginning. Yeah? Evaluate what actually works for you. Design the metrics that actually allow you to assess what is a good pedagogy for you. That's extremely important.
Absolutely. So, do you think the university should pay more attention to virtual learning spaces or physical learning spaces? Or I'm thinking resources are finite, and where should money be directed for the best learning experience for the students? Any ideas? Because they're looking blank.
There's a risk of focusing too much on virtual learning spaces, in that there ceases to be a rationale for the university if you're not careful, because you know, people coming together in a place and learning together is a kind of a unique selling, not a unique selling point, but it's a key sort of part of what a university like UEA is all about. So, you know, if you point to those two options and say which one is most important, it's physical rather than virtual to my mind. That's not to say we don't want anything virtual or digital going on, but we're a campus university, so it's vital that people come and engage with each other.
And I've got a couple of questions from people here about walks and the purpose of walks. And I know you walk around the campus every day.
I do. I sometimes see you, Polly, don't I?
The hike from Earlham Hall. Is a walk useful to provide academic support for students or personal support? Is one of the questions. And another question is, how do you think walks could be used to stimulate learning?
Well, one of the walks that I take my students on is a walk around Castle Museum, and many of our students perhaps don't visit it when they're here, and it's quite a remarkable space. And I take a walk around, and then the curators take my students on a walk around that space as well, and they talk about the history of the exhibits and how they were displayed, why they were displayed. And I think that's why that's not an outdoor walk, it's a walk within a space, and it's a learning journey within a space. And I think that's incredibly valuable, and that module is all about how we view science concepts within kind of history. And that's really important, and the students gain a lot out of doing that. So from a point of view of knowing what's on their doorstep, but also from a cultural perspective and also a historical perspective, because perhaps our science students don't always get that aspect within their curriculum. So I like it because it's cross-disciplinary. They get to see science curation in an interesting place.
Do you think just the act of getting out there, out of the classroom, actually stimulates their thought process?
Absolutely. They come at it from a very different approach. I think they're more open-minded. They see it as something which is perhaps more fun, and it's a really good thing to do.
They taste freedom.
They do.
And does anybody else use? Oh yes, Jeremy. Look, let's.
Hi, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how learning enhancement tutors have used walking and movement more generally in relation to working with students to help them develop the way that they learn, the way that they write. So we found it really important to think about the embodied element of learning. So we found that walking tutorials, introducing walking into one-to-one tutorials has been really important for changing the way that changing the nature of the relationship and discussion between tutor and student, and also for engaging in a different way with ideas and with your writing. We've also introduced yoga and meditation into writing retreats and writers' groups as well, again to recognise that physical or embodied element to learning as well. And it's been enormously helpful, I think, and the students that we work with have responded really positively to it, and I think there are things that can be achieved by introducing that to the work that we do that can't otherwise be achieved. And again, it just opens out different spaces which in our experience lead to different kinds of thinking and different kinds of conversations.
I know that there's a PhD walking group, and I suspect that is anyone here part of the PhD walking group? I suspect that opens up, that leads to good links between different disciplines and different people working on that, and helps as well with a sense of isolation. And I think there's a staff maze, not a literal maze unless you want to come over to the Earlham Hall, not garden, but there's a walking maze for staff wellbeing, isn't there, in the Multi-Faith Centre? Yeah, where you can sort of walk and meditate a route, I think, as a member of staff. Are there any more questions?
It's just about the walk, not a question.
Okay.
Well, in the business school, in the program of brand leadership, the students at the end of the first semester, they need to go to the city centre, identify small businesses with problems with the branding, not marketing, but the branding of the business. They could be charities or small businesses that they don't have a good impact in their businesses and the way that they do their activities. Previously, the business school was able to pay the taxi for 30 students, but now there is a constraint in the budget. So on the way to London, we stop in the city centre. They've got 1 hour to do that exercise, very fruitful, and then they need to walk to the train station on the way to an event in London. So people may say that we don't have resources, but we need to be more creative in the way that we continue doing the tasks that are beneficial for the students.
I just wanted to ask Kate how many students you take, because that's one of the things I'm aware of, that the sorts of things we're talking about are sort of small group activities as opposed to sort of 100 or 200, but I'm just assuming that...
It's around, I think the most we've ever taken is probably 30. It's a session which I run that it's not compulsory because the curators take them behind the scenes. That's quite a small, cramped space, narrow corridors. So we split them up into kind of 2 groups. So maximum I've taken is around about 30.
One of the... oh, sorry.
Thanks. It seems to me that when we're talking about, for example, doing field work or taking people for walks around the museum and things like that, what we should not ignore is, as it were, the microsociology that is, as it were, separate from the learning process as such, which is, I mean, my experience of doing that sort of thing is that students are much more relaxed about contributing in seminars and what have you. Afterwards, there's much more camaraderie. It's incredibly expensive when they all want chocolate with marshmallows on top of it, and you've inadvertently said you'll buy it for them all when you get... Anyway, but, I mean, I think that side of things is something that we don't give enough attention to, and I think the university needs to pay attention to the microsociology of the arrangements of spaces, amongst other things of which the arrangements of space is part, so that we can optimise things in terms of the learning processes, so that, for example, Fabio's business about the spaces in economics, so that there is a social space which is also where you can bumping into people is terribly important. You know, if you look at you know, what I know about multiple universities came out of a lunch where I had to sit down next door to someone in, you know, the classic arrangement over lunch in a Cambridge college. So, you know, we need to think about the eating spaces in the university so that there are common tables where it is accepted that, for example, you'll talk to whoever you sit down next to, and you should sit down next to someone, not sit in isolation looking at your phone, for example. We need to think about social spaces for faculty, where if we're going to pursue interdisciplinarity, we've made that feasible. I can think back to circumstances in the 1970s when we had a senior common room, for example. I happened to have a cup of tea with Hubert Lamb. We thought it might be a good idea if we got together some historians and some climatologists for an afternoon seminar sometime. By 1979, it had turned into the first history and climate conference. So those sorts of things, at the level, we need more sophistication about the way we think about the spaces in the university in order to achieve our larger goals, as it were. And some of those things are to do with spaces that we have said, oh, we haven't got time, you know, space for that, that we removed a senior common room because it was a bit old fuddy-duddy and one thing or the other. But we need to think about the equivalents of those in modern terms. And we think for faculty, and we need to think about those in terms of forwarding research, and we need to think about those arrangements for students so that they become engaged, so that the learning is not something that goes on in the spaces that are presented to them in terms of lecture theatres and seminar rooms. We need to try and get them to become really engaged with what they're doing, and seeing us engaged with what we're doing, because it's that they're sharing social spaces is one of the ways of doing that.
So one of the questions I've got here from someone is a conversation a learning space? And it sounds like to you it absolutely would be, and it's about making room for that conversation to happen.
Can I
Yes.
just chip in as
Yes,
well,
of
just to say that I think that's a really important point, and I think in Lasden's sort of concept of the campus, those informal encounters and bumping into people was was absolutely core to the design of the campus, and I think that you're right. There's been huge space pressures over the last 10-15 years as the university has grown, and some of those sort of common rooms have been wrung out of the system and turned often into teaching spaces. And I think it is a really important and I think fruitful line of thought to be thinking about how we try and engineer those opportunities for informal encounters. With the space of the campus that we have, and with changing working practices as well. I think staff often get together within their schools, but that's an inhibitor of interdisciplinary serendipitous encounters, and we need to be thinking about how we create more kinds of events where people bump into each other and spend time together.
I bump into these two. He's on in Vista. And he's smoking outside the Chancellor's School.
Naughty Fabio.
That's useful, I need to speak to them, I get things done.
Interestingly enough, of course, I'm just trying to quit for that, but I'm not going to give up my walks. Because when I have a problem, where I have something to think about, I leave my office and I go for a walk in front of and that is such an enriching experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the gardens at the Earlham Hall are being rebranded as a silent space, or sort of meditative space as well, which is lovely. I've got a final question here, which is there still value in teaching students in uniform groups? So unless the author of this question wants to identify themselves, I'm interpreting this as being about teaching students in a particular year group altogether rather than looking at particular individual learning needs. So is the author here who wants to chime in on a no fear basis? All right. Uniform groups.
It's interesting because one of the presentations, I was chairing before this event was Coral Drain from HSC, who was talking about the apprenticeship that they're running in healthcare and the tension, but also the benefits of running sessions with BSc nurses on the traditional nursing program and nurses on the apprenticeship nursing program in the same classroom at the same time. That is clearly a mixed group. And there were clearly benefits, and certainly the students on the apprenticeship program felt the benefits, but there were also tensions, and the tension came largely, I think, from the students on the other program who felt that the apprenticeship students were being given so much more support, so much more attention, so much more time. It is the nature of apprenticeship, that's always going to happen because of the requirements of it. So the benefits accrued to one group but weren't necessarily immediately apparent to the other. But what the apprenticeship nurses were able to bring to the table was a huge amount of practical experience which they could share. So the advantage of working in a non-uniform group was the capacity to disseminate common areas of practice whilst also recognising and then perhaps even dealing with potential issues and potential areas of tension and conflict.
There's some great work going on in HSC about interprofessional practice and learning to communicate each other's language and professional respect and things like that. But that brings us back to the point about not only sending our students out, but bringing other people into our physical learning spaces from outside. And of course, in the law school, we do that. As Becca said, I'm Chief Operating Officer of our law clinic. So we have professionals coming in to work with our students and members of the public as well in our building. I'm aware that there are some hands up.
Can I
Of
answer?
course.
I have the question that was punted from the
Of
previous
course.
discussion. Yeah.
Of course.
No, it's just there was some discussion about flexible social spaces and the general way that we're moving towards that, because there are a lot of pressures, and I understand this, about diversity and about multi-use and about all these other things. But I'm very much reminded of some really useful stuff that came out of a talk about writing spaces by Peter Thomas. And one of the key things he identified is that students really want a sense of ownership, even if it's only temporary ownership of some spaces. And I've noticed that a lot, in that if you've got a desk that you know is yours for a day or for a week or whatever, and you can put your books on it and you can remain logged in on the computer or whatever it is, then that is potentially a much more productive space for you than it is if every time you go out to get a cup of coffee, you have to come back and get a new desk and you have to carry all your stuff on your back. And so there is a sense of tension there, I think, between this move towards everything being generic and flexible and on wheels and in the corridors and whatever, and actually saying, well, maybe there are some spaces needed which are more personal, more private, more bookable, more ownable for people who want to work that way at that point.
Is anybody here from the library? Ah, because I know that you've done a lot of work on spaces for students and the issue of how you reach demand, how you meet demand when there's so much pressure for spaces.
Yeah, I think you're quite right, because I was thinking of how students can't actually leave their stuff on the desk. Or they can, but what happens then is someone else wants to use the PC or the desk, and we get complaints that there isn't enough space. I mean, the space has opened up, like 01. There are some really nice boothed areas, so that you're using more space, but with the partitions, so that it can feel more private. And I suspect people do have their favourite desks. I mean, I always did when I was a student, that you would go and get. So even though you haven't got your stuff there, that would be your one. But it's a big challenge that the library is continuing to face, because the other thing is that there are still books that, and it's really important to have books in the library, even though lots of stuff is online. Students do identify, and it's one of these intangibles, that they work better. I think Peter said it in his talk, that newer sort of students will go to the library to work, whereas people further on in their career don't necessarily need that sense of whatever the library, strictness or whatever, to give you that work ethic.
Hello. Hi, my name is Michael. I'm a lecturer in the IIH. So to kind of bounce back on space organisation, I was heavily involved when I was a PhD student here in the organisation of workspace that was bookable as opposed to hot desk, right? So there was a group of art students back at the last ref board. We presented a petition. I don't know if anyone from HUM who was here would have been there. But so we organised a space in which it's booked on a set rota for 6 months. I think it's a really good scheme. I think with movement to Sky House, my understanding is that since we asked for it, PhDs will be consulted on the kind of space they like. But there's one thing I really want to crack in on here, which is about partly subjectivity, right? And the way in which we think of pedagogy as a subject relation, right? But there's also an employment relation here. So there's been a lot of talk about breaking down siloisation and enabling kind of staff to bump into each other. And there's two things I think that need to happen for that, right? First is physical, spatial. I mean, Lasden said, if anyone who goes into the arts building can see this, right? The ornaments of the building are the people moving around it. I think that's fundamentally wrong-headed, because I don't think we're the ornaments of the building, right? I think we're the fundamental centre of the university, the staff which make it up, the students which learn in it, right? So if we take that approach to it as opposed to an ornamental one, then I think we end up thinking about these two constraints. One which is spatial, having common areas. Obviously, space is at a massive premium, especially in the arts and humanities, until Building Zero, Sky House comes and saves us all, right? So we've got this space, we need to have communal space, but we also need communal time. And I think most staff at the university are over 100% on their workload models. Most staff at the university don't have time to socialise because they're already either teaching, researching beyond capacity, or are dealing with students who have particular pastoral issues. They don't have time to deal with each other. I mean, the staff survey in HUM shows this, I think. I think it shows that, what was it, 30% of the School of History, near enough, 25% feel bullied at work. And it's one thing to talk about breaking down silos, but it seems like these silos are actually being put up for reasons that people don't have the time to engage with each other, And often because of the way in which management is carried out, the way in which the social and spatial sense of the university is organised in a very striated fashion, means that we don't have the opportunity to bump into each other in a certain kind of way. I don't know if that makes sense.
Actually, my final question was going to be about making time. Yes, temporal space. How do we make time for innovation in teaching, for making contacts with each other? So I'm acutely aware that some of my students hold down more than one part-time job and volunteering, because it's not enough these days to just be a graduate. You have to have all this other stuff on your CV. And that they are really extremely busy, as are we. So the question is, how can we leave here today with a sense that we might be able to achieve something based on what we've discovered here today, rather than going, well, that was great, but now I have a pile of admin and marking to do. So, which is me. So, does anybody have any ideas or determined commitment to how they are going to make temporal space for this?
I think it's a matter of finding what works for you. Now, I'm an economist, so I'm all about cost and benefits. And, I devote a lot of effort in what I like, which is pedagogical practice, of course, that's what. But what I try to do with colleagues is just helping them to find what is good for them. What teaching space is good for you? What actually works for you? And then you invest a lot of resources on that, and you find out that it's something that saves your time, rather than increasing the time that you are supposed to devote to that. And I think sometimes we make some miscalculation. We feel that a task like learning a new technology package or like experimenting a new pedagogy is something that takes away time from you, but you discount the benefits that you can have in the future about that. So it's about actually recalibrating all that and being a bit more open in experimenting.
But actually, the time, the social time, or the ability to talk to each other about what we're up to is really, really helpful, both from a well-being perspective and in terms of, the advice that you've given me about teaching practice, and Phil, and your never-ending list of relevant pedagogy for everything. Yeah. So actually, the ability to make time with you two, we'll make time in the future, has been really valuable. So, does anybody... Yes.
Thank you for that, Polly. It's nice to know it has something back. If we were doing ref on this, I'm sure that would be a fun. But I think, it's echoing what Fabio's just said, I think one of the things we have to be very careful about, and mindful of comments that have been made by colleagues, we have to avoid becoming habituated in our practice, because once we buy into that, we never change, and we just keep on repeating and repeating ad infinitum, and nothing changes, and we are just running ourselves into the ground. So sometimes the most useful thing we can do is just say, actually, I am busy, but I am going to take that walk. I am going to go and think about this. I will go and find Vic and talk to him about it, or Neil, or Kay, or especially Polly, or Fabio.
Lovely. Right. On that note, I think I'm going to draw matters to a close. Thank you very much, panel. Thank you very much, audience. And I'm going to hand back to Rebecca. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Polly, and thank you very much for the panel, and thank you for everybody who participated. And can I just ask you to write a feedback card on your way out? We really, really value your opinions on